Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for gathering here at ITI World Headquarters. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special event today. My name is Jason Oxman. I'm the president and CEO of ITI, the premier global advocate for the tech industry. Happy Thursday, happy Cyber Strategy Implementation Day. On behalf of ITI's 80 member companies, we are honored and truly privileged to host this very special discussion today. It is the launch of the implementation plan of the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy. And quite honestly, I can't think of a more critical or more timely conversation for ITI to host today. We all know in the tech industry and indeed in all industries that the tech industry serves, that cybersecurity is really a shared responsibility for all of us. And from individuals to businesses to governments, we all work in partnership with one another, a commitment to adopting practices and protections that we all need to guard networks, systems, facilities, devices from foreign and domestic threats. And ITI, as the trade association of the technology industry, has been a lead advocate here in the US and around the world for the adoption of more secure and resilient digital systems and ecosystems for an inclusive cyber workforce that we all want to be securing our infrastructure. We've been active partners at ITI, together with our member companies, with Congress and the Biden administration, as they revise their approach to critical infrastructure security. ITI developed, published, and deployed the first of their kind policy principles for security incident reporting that help guide mandatory incident reporting policy in the US and around the world. We've also been working hard with lawmakers to advocate for critical reforms that are necessary through the Federal Information Security Modernization Act as well. And we continue to support, including up to today and this morning's event, the Biden administration's important work to implement policy initiatives, including both the cyber strategy, but also the Internet of Things cybersecurity labeling work, supply chain security, and NIST's cybersecurity framework. You all are hopefully familiar with the phenomenal cybersecurity team here at ITI. John Miller, Courtney Lang are here. Hopefully you'll have an opportunity to talk with them about all of this important work. Secure and resilient ICT ecosystem. That's what this is about. It's central to ensuring that consumers, businesses, industries, governments all have trust and confidence in putting together the information that we all need online and conducting the business that needs to be done. A unified US cybersecurity strategy is foundational to that effort and to advancing US leadership in technology, in innovation, and in national security. That's why ITI welcomed the release when it happened of the Biden administration's national cybersecurity strategy. It was a vital step to aligning and bolstering America's cyber defenses. The strategy, as you all know, laid out an incredibly thoughtful vision for America's cybersecurity policy. But the key to the strategy's success, of course, is its implementation. Coupled with industry collaboration, the implementation plan published this morning has the potential to realize that vision of a more secure, a more resilient, and a more economically prosperous future. Importantly, it paves a pathway to the coordination that's necessary between agencies and industry partners, particularly here in the technology sector. We welcome the industry's work together with the Biden administration and the administration's stated intention to involve industry in the strategy's implementation. And today, we couldn't be more thrilled to be hosting Acting Director Kemba Walden to share more about the strategy's implementation. Acting Director Walden has been instrumental in shepherding this critical plan from the release of the strategy through today's release of the implementation plan. ITI was fortunate to have her share many of her thoughts and the plan for the path forward at our Intersect event in January, and we look forward to hearing more from her today. Now, this morning, following Acting Director Walden's remarks, we'll hear from two panels of industry experts from across several government agencies that will be involved in this implementation plan. They're going to share with us how they plan to move this forward in coordination with other government agencies and with the private sector to address these rapidly emerging threats. Now, the diverse set of agencies that are represented on today's panel underscore the complexities of executing on this holistic cybersecurity policy. And to that end, we're very encouraged at ITI that the implementation plan promotes harmonizing, streamlining, and deconflicting any new or existing regulations as a top priority. If done successfully, this will give industry a much needed, clear, and effective roadmap to the rules of the road to drive security and resilience. It's my ongoing hope and the hope of ITI and our member companies that with the National Cybersecurity Strategy, industry and government can continue to collaborate, to come together, to deliver a comprehensive cybersecurity plan that is consistent, reflects a constantly evolving threat landscape, and incorporates the interconnected and global nature of today's digital environment. With that, it is my pleasure and great honor to introduce our featured speaker, Acting National Cyber Director, Kemba Walden. Thank you so much. And thank you. I should note, I got a copy. So all you have to do to get a copy of this is to host an event and bring together dozens of people. Congratulations on the release. Thank you for the honor of hosting you here today. And we very much look forward to your remarks.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Good. Wow, I like it. National Cybersecurity Strategy Implementation Day. I think that's a good title for today. Well, thank you, Jason, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, ITI, for inviting me. The National Cybersecurity Strategy is built on a foundation of collaboration, so I always appreciate the opportunity to talk to key industry partners, especially ITI members, that have so many important responsibilities for keeping their customers and the ecosystem secure. President Biden shared his bold vision for the future of cyberspace with the world when he signed out the National Cybersecurity Strategy on March 2nd. And today, I'm proud to announce the next step in making that vision a reality: the National Cybersecurity Strategy Implementation Plan. First and foremost, I want to thank my colleagues. I see many of them in the audience here from the interagency who contributed to this plan and whom are charged with doing the hard work of implementation. I know we have two exciting panels coming up of leaders from those departments and agencies, but before we get to them, I wanted to provide some perspective to the importance of why we are here today. Recognizing that if you came downtown at 9 a.m. this morning to hear about an implementation plan, then you're definitely into all the wonky details. And I don't want to keep you from them. I see Nick Neerson here in the front row, and Drennan Dudley there, and many members of the staff who are here to give you all those wonky details. I see Tom McDermott, who hired me into formally NPPD a lifetime ago. But before we get to them, let me briefly sketch out how we got here, where we're going, and why it's important. First, as this room certainly knows, the president is clear in his vision for a cyberspace that reflects our values, equity, inclusivity, and a cyberspace that supports every American in their ability to safely and securely take advantage of information and communications technology. And through two pivotal shifts, to have the more capable actors in cyberspace have more responsibility for security, and to encourage investment in long-term resilience, and across 5 pillars and 27 objectives, this strategy is our North Star. But as many of you will have heard me say before, my favorite page of the strategy is, in fact, the last page, where we outline how it will be implemented. After all, like Jason acknowledged, a strategy is only useful if it guides coherent action, and implementation is a manifestation of that guidance. Thankfully, President Biden was as bold in his commitment to implementation as he was in his articulation of his goals for cyberspace. In the National Cybersecurity Strategy, he directed that we publish the implementation plan and report to him annually on our progress. This document is the first iteration of the administration fulfilling this direction. So here are a couple of quick things that you should know about the plan. It has 69 initiatives, each of which has a singular responsible agency and an expected quarter for completion. 18 different agencies are leading at least one initiative, each of which is tied back to a specific strategy reference. Implementation has already begun in earnest. Just a few weeks ago, the Department of Justice announced a new national security cyber section to improve their ability to disrupt malicious cyber actors. I can't tell you how excited I am to have the plan in hand, which is full of similar terrific proposals. And I want to thank all of the hundreds of people who helped develop the strategy and the broad swath of interagency partners who made this a reality. If that's how we got here today, then where are we going? I expect you'll be hearing a lot more from the federal government in the coming months as we tick off milestones on our way to completion of initiatives. I, for one, am eager to share with the broader community some of our ideas on addressing gaps in cybersecurity workforce and education. And I have the opportunity to do so in the coming weeks. But there are some important procedural things to keep in mind as well about how the implementation will work. The implementation plan is a living document and it is iterative in nature. It will be fundamental to this success. The strategy is meant to be enduring and is crafted to guide policy across the decisive decade in which we find ourselves. Implementation plan, on the other hand, will evolve, whether in response to changing threat landscape or as initiatives are completed and beget follow-on actions. We will continue to update the plan. In practice, that means ONCD will take what we learn from the request for information on regulatory harmonization that we are developing and turn it into actionable steps to help us live in a world where we are providing that you've met baseline requirements to one regulator will suffice for all of them. We have an inkling as to some of those steps, but we need to hear from our stakeholders about the inconsistent regulations they see and the concerns they have before putting them into action. And that's exactly what an iterative approach to implementation allows us to do. So next spring, you can expect to see version 2.0 of this plan, which will be updated annually going forward. We require your feedback as to what's working and what we can improve on. After all, that's part of the point of making the plan public. We, the government and the private sector, need to hold each other accountable to meet our shared goals and our shared responsibility for keeping Americans safe online. And as I said, the president expects an annual report on progress toward implementation, but we will only achieve those geometric outcomes we aspire to if we improve the implementation process itself. And we can't do that without the help of industry, civil society, security researchers, and our partners in Congress. Which brings me back to the all-important question of why. Why is this document something that may have looked at some point like a giant spreadsheet? Why is that so important? A part of the answer, of course, derives from the strategy itself. I want to live in the world the president described, where we build technology to achieve equitable outcomes for society on fundamentally secure foundations, such that we, not our adversaries, get to dictate our terms of our future. But if the strategy is the destination, the implementation is the roadmap to get there. It does not capture all of the national cybersecurity activities in the federal government, nor does it intend to. What it does do is capture the key activities that we must get done on the path to achieving the president's vision. What it does do is help us set priorities, just as the budget and guidance for federal agencies that Director Young and I signed out a few weeks ago. What it does do is help us ensure accountability so that we know we will meet the president's goals and ensure what the federal government, one of the more capable actors in the cyber ecosystem, is practicing what we preach when we say that we will shoulder more of the responsibility for cybersecurity. A core value of my office is that the public's trust be earned, and accountability is a mechanism to do so. I like the roadmap metaphor for one other reason, and it's tied to the reason we chose to publish the implementation plan in the first place. That's new and novel for the White House to do. The private sector, civil society, academia, security researchers, the entities in this room are key partners in this whole of society effort. The implementation plan is a roadmap for you too. If you want to know which agency is responsible for what and on what timeline, it's all there for you to read. I like reading it cover to cover, but feel free to Control F your way through it. It's not meant to be read cover to cover, apparently. But we need you to work with us on implementation if we're to succeed. And I can tell you that one of the key things that ONCD will be looking at as we oversee the actioning of this plan is how agencies are collaborating with stakeholders. It's essential. I could go on, but I know the real experts are here waiting in the wings to dive into particulars of 1.4.2 and 3.3.1. But as a parting thought, I would ask that you please use this document. We wrote it to guide the federal government's actions, that's clear, but we published it for you. Use it. Give us feedback. And I pledge to you that the journey to reach President Biden's destination won't take as long as you think. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the deep dive from our interagency colleagues.
Please join me in thanking Acting National Cyber Director Kimber Walden, not only for her remarks about implementation, but for her leadership. So thank you. So I'm James Hayes, Senior Vice President of Tenable's Global Government Affairs Office. I'm dual-hatted today. I'm also the Executive Chair of ITI's Executive Committee. And my job today is to introduce Panel 1. And ITI has done a great job of assembling a ton of cybersecurity talent. I'm concerned we might be jeopardizing national security by having so much cyber talent on hand today. But Panel 1 of these experts that you've heard Acting Director Walden talk about and encourage us to collaborate with, you've heard the task. So we need to collaborate, be stakeholders, and engage with these experts on this implementation as we go forward. So first up will be Nick Leisterson, Assistant National Cyber Director for Cyber Policy and Programs. So Nick, if you could come up and be seated at the podium. Tom McDermott, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber Infrastructure, Risk and Resilience Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. Thank you for joining us, Tom. Kevin Stein, Chief Applied Security Division, National Institute of Standards and Technology. Kevin, it's nice to see you someplace other than RSA conference. And this panel will be moderated by Mike Flynn, ITI's Vice President and Counsel. Take it away, Mike. Thank you.
Thanks, James, and welcome to the wonky details. This first panel is really going to be the domestic focus of the conversation. Our second panel is going to be the international, that outward facing component. I like to think we're tackling the fun part from my perspective, because so many of the the security by design, security by default, incident reporting, the sector risk management piece of this equation, these are some of the details that ITM members really, really care about. So it's an honor to moderate this panel. We've agreed to skip opening remarks because we have limited time, and I want to get to 1.1.2. So with that, Nick, could you walk us through where the implementation plan kind of sits in this row of documents? Strategy, implementation plan, what's the next level deeper?
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. And thank you very much, ITI, for hosting us today on this auspicious launch of the implementation plan. So I think, again, one of the things that Acting Director Walden emphasized is this is meant to be an iterative document. So the strategy will last until the president decides that he wants to write a new one. But the implementation plan is going to be updated annually. So you should not look at this and say, okay, when we're done with the last item in here, which is in fiscal year 26, so not so far down the road, that we will have reached the president's vision. That's not the intent at all. The intent is to say, these are the different activities that we need to get to on a timeline that we can understand that will build to that final vision that he's articulated in the strategy. For the folks in this room, then I think what you really need to keep in mind is as we work forward on implementation, yes, we'll be looking for feedback from industry, from civil society, from other stakeholders on how are we doing on any of the particular initiatives on, 141 fixing or rewriting the National Cyber Incident Response Plan. But we will also be looking for new initiatives, right? Like we will be looking to industry stakeholders to say, hey, these are things that are in line with the president's vision that we want to see the government do in collaboration with us. And our hope absolutely is that when you see the next iteration, it'll have new things that are generated from our conversations with industry. So if there's one thing I think we can foot stamp about the process and about the document itself is that it is iterative. I'm an engineer. I love iterative processes, right? And it hopefully is going to get better year in and year out.
Thanks, Nick. And I'm coming right back to you because if Director Walden's favorite page of the implementation plan was the last, mine was actually the first, at least proverbially, because 1.1.1 is regulatory harmonization, which is, you've heard Jason Oxman, our president, talk about it. It's a topic of great interest to industry players. And one nuance in the plan wasn't just regulatory harmonization, it was requirement harmonization, coordinating all the various requirements, security requirements that are kind of currently on ecosystem. Nick, could you just talk us a little bit how the role of ONCD and kind of what the end state looks like? Because it was ambitious to put a deadline for something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, as the owner of this particular initiative, I don't want to say that we're quite as ambitious as maybe we hope, right? What we're looking for first is developing a framework. That's how one of the things I think you'll hear consistently from at least the ethos of ONCD is that we are incrementalists in the sense of, we are picking hard problems. Cybersecurity challenges are very complex. I don't have to tell that to anyone in this room, right? And I at least first started hearing about regulatory harmonization challenges in 2011 when I was a year into my work with Congressman Langevin, and they still exist. So these are not things that you can just snap your finger and we fixed. But when you look at how are we thinking about it at ONCD, we're thinking about it primarily in two frames, right? One is that what we're really after to the greatest extent possible is reciprocity. Harmonization is great. It's essential and it builds on a foundation of alignment, right? Like there are going to be sector specific, for instance, requirements or regulatory requirements that will come out, and you want them all to be aligned. We really don't want to see things going off in completely orthogonal directions. We want them to be aligned to things like the cybersecurity framework. But when you're talking about baseline IT requirements, right, and you're looking across ICT and saying, hey, across all of these sectors, we're using a lot of the same fundamental technologies, there we would start to say, yeah, well, the requirements themselves, at least for the baseline, we would like to see those be harmonized. And what's more, we don't just want to see that the requirements are the same. What we want to see is that there is some degree of reciprocity. So when I've proved to one particular regulator that I met the common baseline, not that there won't be other things that come on top of it based on sector specific risks, but that I don't have to go and then say, okay, well, we started with the same harmonized requirements, but another regulator comes in and says, yeah, but we're not sure that you've actually met them based on someone else's audit. So that's really like when we talk about the vision, right? That's what we're talking about. In terms of how to get there, I think, the first step from the ONCD standpoint that the director mentioned is we're looking to do a request for information to hear from industry about where are areas of overlapping regulation that are duplicative, that are conflicting, that are hopefully not, but sometimes we've heard contradictory, and use that as a roadmap, right? To say, okay, how can we build a framework on top of this? And we're working very closely with independent regulatory commissions through the Cybersecurity Forum for Executive Branch and independent regulators to talk through kind of these framework ideas and where we're going with that. But I think it will be a years-long process, but one that, if we are deliberate about it and if we build a good framework, we can get to a much better outcome domestically, and then hopefully leverage that in an international context as well to say, hey, we have a working, reciprocal cybersecurity framework for baseline requirements for critical infrastructure. Now let's see if we can export that.
That's great. And you used a word in there, I think is a nice segue to the next question, which is framework. This all starts with frameworks, right? And perhaps, at least in our conversation, the cybersecurity framework is from NIST is the kind of seminal document, right? And Kevin, NIST is going through the process of CSF 2.0. My favorite quote on this is actually from my colleague, John Miller, who called this an opportunity to bring order to the chaos, which seems like a fairly large role. So could you give us a sense of where things are and opportunities for industry engagement as things move through their iterative process?
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for including us in today's event. And I'll actually maybe key on a different word, and that word is standards, and then I will get to framework in a second, but standards is important. But I first want to reflect on a couple of things I heard in the opening remarks, both from Acting Director Walden, really that spirit of collaboration. I think hopefully that's something that you'll hear from all of us. That's certainly the way we operate at NIST and everything that we do. And I think through the implementation plan, it's really taking that spirit of collaboration, putting it into concrete, actionable activities. Jason Oxman used some very important words that I kind of keyed in on, and trust and confidence. And from our perspective in this, helping to build trust and confidence in products and services and technologies and institutions in some cases, really, from our view, really is anchored or is founded in good, strong standards that are developed in collaborative processes by the community, not just domestically, but certainly internationally as well. So when I think of things like the cybersecurity framework, that is based in standards, in existing standards, technologies, and practices. That's been kind of the mantra of the framework since we started, probably 11 years ago with that development process through multiple iterations to where we are today with we're in the midst of the 2.0 process. But when you think about standards, they really provide the technical underpinnings for the policies and the programs and the decisions that we're making within our own agencies, within our own organizations, and even across the nation and globally as well. Standards are good for establishing, common expectations. They're good for defining requirements. They're good for competition, good for trade, good for national security, good for economic security. So there's a lot of benefits to standards and really anchoring our work, our activities, our decisions in those fundamental resources. The national cyber strategy is obviously what we're talking about today. Recently, though, the administration also issued the national standard strategy, and there are some good cross-references and linkages there. And we were fortunate to have Acting Director Walden at the kickoff event at the White House for the national standard strategy. So as NIST leads the implementation of the national standard strategy, there's going to be tremendous opportunity to kind of bring the best of both of these strategies and their implementations together in a very meaningful and open and collaborative way. So we're certainly excited about that. More specifically to the cybersecurity framework, I mentioned that's based on standards. We are in the midst of an update now. I know most of you, probably all of you are tracking that, and I know you've provided a lot of feedback. Not all that feedback is well aligned, so we're working through that adjudication process now. But I think a few things we've heard pretty loudly, pretty clearly, increasing treatment of governance in the framework. There was certainly governance sprinkled throughout the current final version, but elevating that to in framework language to a function to elevate the importance of governance in the cybersecurity domain is critically important. Heard a lot about supply chain across the entire spectrum of we like this, we don't like that, everything in between. We are going to continue to increase treatment of supply chain, most likely by kind of sprinkling it in much more significant ways than where it is today. Tremendous opportunities through this update process to just continue to further amplify really the primary value proposition of the framework as I see it over the last 10 plus years is really as using that common language as a powerful communication tool, not just within our own organizations, up and down the hierarchy, horizontally with our partners and suppliers, even with across sectors and with other nations as well. But I think in the context of some of the requirements, alignment, and harmonization activities reflected in the strategy, there's a tremendous value or value proposition or opportunity to leverage the cybersecurity framework in regulatory discussions as well. I think that was part of the original intent way back in 2013, 2014 timeframe. So I think as the framework has evolved and continues to evolve in this 2.0 process, we're going to be looking for opportunities and engaging with the regulatory forums and other interagency and industry partners to understand how the framework can better be leveraged to take advantage of that value of that common language and taxonomy to help bring greater alignment across different regulatory regimes, all from our perspective done in a very open and collaborative way. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. We're building on this theme of harmonization, of collaboration with stakeholders. There was, perhaps one of the more kind of central key initiatives in terms of the kind of shift in emphasis towards a slightly more prescriptive approach, Tom, was the secure by design, secure by default principles that CISA produced back in April with FBI, with NSA and 6 other countries, including the UK and Canada. I was kind of curious if you could give us some insights on how that document was produced, and is that the beginning of a conversation? Are there going to be opportunities for other stakeholder engagement there?
Great. Thank you. It's great to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience here today. It's truly a great event. So thank you to ITI for hosting and having us as part of the event. As Director Walden mentioned in her remarks, obviously federal agencies have not been sitting around since the strategy was released, waiting for an implementation plan to come and tell us what to do. We have been, obviously, often working since the strategy was released and perhaps even before the strategy was released. And so you mentioned the secure by design principles, which were released by CISA, on behalf of the department, following the release of the strategy. And I think that is a great example. That document is a great example of a couple of themes that are in the national strategy, and also I think the conversation so far this morning. The principles of secure by design, I think, really reflect the shift in the strategy toward asking those that are best positioned and have the greatest capability to drive better security and ecosystem to do more, and to ask the biggest and most capable players to do more to drive security in the ecosystem, rather than asking everyone, all the small players, to try to meet the security demands themselves. And I think that document is also a great example of, although we see in this strategy the recognition that we do need to look toward requirements and regulations where necessary, that really government public-private partnership really remains a core element and theme of our approach to cybersecurity. And so the secure by design principles that were released by CISA are meant to be very much in that sort of spirit of voluntary cooperation, working government and industry together to develop shared approaches to how we can get at cybersecurity challenges and outcomes, much like the cybersecurity performance goals that CISA has also released, which again very much relate back to the NIST cybersecurity framework, but also look at what CISA has seen from an intelligence and operational perspective to kind of help prioritize for entities the types of security measures that they can begin to implement in sort of a prioritized way based on operational risk. But turning to the secure by design and default principles, those that white paper was released in April, as you mentioned, and I think really importantly by several U.S. agencies and 7 international partners. So truly intended to be an international effort to drive at how a lot of countries are thinking about and approaching these problems in a similar way. And really with the goal of trying to encourage manufacturers to take ownership of security outcomes on behalf of their customers, and to stop reliance on customers trying to fix vulnerabilities in products after the fact, after they've been released into the stream of commerce, when it's often sort of much harder and certainly much more uneven in terms of the ability to apply security requirements. And secure by design really comes down to treating and thinking about security as a core business goal, and focusing really on shipping secure products rather than a rush to get products to market quickly either with vulnerabilities or not having a great understanding of what the vulnerabilities or lack of security features in products might look like. And similarly, the concept of secure by default really focuses on products that are secure out of the box without the need for customers to take a whole series of steps to configure products or do complex measures to make sure that the products can be deployed in a secure fashion. So the document that CISA and many counterparts released back in April was very much not meant to be the end of the conversation. I think CISA's release was clear that they are seeking feedback on the document. They continue to seek feedback on the document and the concept, and very much envision that being a continued conversation with industry. And a lot of the ITI members have been a key part of that conversation. And it's also the beginning of the conversation in terms of how we think about shifting conversations around incentives and how we can encourage companies to move in the direction of adopting those principles that are laid out in that document. And so that's work that the National Cyber Strategy, that the implementation plan call for in terms of CISA working closely with NCD to look at how we can start thinking about market incentives and trying to create a shift in the ecosystem toward encouraging adopting of those types of products and encouraging companies and software developers as they're developing new products to do so with those principles in mind. So very much work that was underway since the strategy was released, and very much work that will continue and look forward to that being a continuing conversation as we implement that task from the strategy and really the rest of the implementation plan as well.
I'm going to call an audible because you brought up a couple of things there that just kind of sparked my thoughts, because we had talked a little bit about incident reporting and that the new statute that Congress passed last year, 2 years ago at this point, and you've started the process, CISA started the process of implementing CIRCIA. For those not tracking on the wonkiness, is the cyber incident reporting legislation. One of the things in that law is the regulatory harmonization piece. And incident reporting the last couple of years has been such a hot topic. So many different regulators in the US and obviously other countries too have jumped onto this issue. And you have a council at DHS that's started a process to talk to some of the folks that are implementing those requirements, including most notably the SEC, which is a real hot topic for our members. So I was curious if you could give some insights into how the council's working, how the implementation of CIRCIA is going.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously fundamentally it is challenging for the federal government or the ecosystem to adequately manage cyber risks when we don't have a full picture of what's happening out in the real world in terms of cyber events. And so CIRCIA was really a significant step forward, from Congress to increase the visibility that we have as a federal government and as an ecosystem, really across multiple critical infrastructures to understand what's happening in terms of cyber incidents and what the impacts of those incidents could be. So as you mentioned, CISA is certainly well underway in their efforts to develop the rulemaking required by the statute, which will impose cyber incident and ransomware payment reporting requirements for covered critical infrastructure entities. So CISA issued an RFI, did a series of listening sessions to collect input from stakeholders to inform that rulemaking process. And they are very much pencils out, heads down, working on sort of turning the feedback that they've gotten into text. And they tell me well on track to have the NPRM ready for early next year. But important to recognize that that CISA rulemaking authority is not in a vacuum, right? It was very much sort of on top of existing cyber incident reporting requirements. And so Congress directed DHS through the Cyber Incident Reporting Council or the CIRC to look at existing and future incident reporting requirements and look for opportunities to streamline and harmonize incident reporting. So the secretary, as the chair of that council, convened more than 30 agencies to meet multiple times to look at, again, current and future requirements. I will say that we identified over 45 current federal cyber incident reporting requirements in place by more than 22 agencies. So if industry's sense is that there's more than one incident reporting requirements, it seems like perhaps the facts bear that out. But through, through the council, through participation of these more than 30 agencies, through a series of sessions that DHS convened with industry, with many of the companies that are represented here today, we've developed a series of recommendations and potential legislative proposals that we think Congress might consider to help streamline that process. And I keep saying this, but really hopeful that that report will be out in the very near future. And really hopefully in the next couple of weeks, which we think, again, sort of the theme of the day, right, will not be the last word, I think, on the issue. But I think identifies some areas where we think agencies can take some concrete steps to harmonize the requirements around incident reporting, and really a lot of the concepts that that Nick talked about in terms of baseline cyber requirements, I think are equally as applicable to cyber incident reporting. So, the report and the recommendations look at things like, common definitions, common thresholds for when you sort of cross the line of having to report an incident to one or more agencies, to try to align better around sort of the content of reports, what information the government seeks, and can we seek it in formats in ways that are more aligned to reduce the burden on industry. Because I think we all want industry to spend its time, ideally not having to respond to incidents, but when they are responding to incidents, to focus on the response and the mitigation and not on the machinery of reporting to multiple agencies. So that work is really well underway, and hopefully in the near future we'll have something a little bit more concrete to talk about with many of the companies that are here today.
That's great. We're a little short on time. So just for the panelists' awareness, because I'm gonna try to get to a couple more topics. We're building a theme of the global community being involved in this conversation. So whether it's incident reporting, secure by design, secure by default, or the supply chain piece of the equation, are there opportunities here for international harmonization, international engagement, and how can industry stakeholders, other stakeholders help drive that piece of the equation? Kevin, I want to get you first on this, if I could.
Yeah, happy to. And there certainly is. And I think it's great that CISA issued the paper with the secure by design principles. And I think, pulling together that group of that type of community to kind of have agreement on those principles is very powerful, especially with all the international voices that were represented there. And I think from our view, to kind of take that to the next level, from a principles level down into actual implementation and action, shocker, comes down to standards and practices. And there are a lot of existing standards and practices on an international scale, as well as things we've issued at NIST and even others in the interagency that can be taken advantage of. Some of those have been updated recently, like the secure software development framework that has a strong kind of software supply chain security component, and secure by design, a lot of secure by design activities folded in there, and certainly some refreshes recently in response to recent executive orders. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to use those existing standards and practices, identify some gap areas, and then work together as a community to kind of address those. I think from the broader cybersecurity supply chain risk management perspective, in some ways, there's a lot of guidance that's out there now. We think there's a lot of great guidance, and that's what we want, whether it's from NIST or other agencies or international standards bodies. Our sense is that we're kind of moving into this phase of, okay, there's a lot of awareness that cyber supply chain is a concern, is a challenge for many organizations. We're at the point where we want to encourage greater use, kind of recognition of the risks, use of the resources to take action to help address, mitigate, or remediate some of the risks that have been identified within organizations across sectors, even at a national level and international level. So using those supply chain practices, not just within our organizations, but even globally, is going to be powerful. Most of the things that we produced in the past in the supply chain space up to recently have focused on the acquirers and the users. I think things like the SSDF, Secure Software Development Framework, are moving in the direction, certainly, of more guidance for producers. And we think there's opportunities to kind of take that SSDF, that model, and work with producers of, for example, hardware, of semiconductors and 5G and beyond technologies as well. So I think from a supply chain perspective, that's kind of the trajectory that we're heading in.
That's fantastic. Because of limited time, I'm gonna move on, if that's okay, because I know that Nick wants to talk about workforce. I'm inclined just to say, Nick, workforce, go. But I will say y'all are in the process of developing a workforce and education strategy, more inclusive workforce, et cetera. This is an issue that ITI, our member companies, have been heavily invested in and involved in. Could give us a sense of timeline, ways for industry to be involved in that work stream as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, one of the themes that we hope comes out of that is in the strategy and we hope we see in the implementation plan, right, is that we strongly believe not only that there's a shared responsibility in cybersecurity that we have to work together on, but there are also a lot of win-win propositions. So regulatory harmonization is a win-win proposition. We get better cybersecurity for less money because people can focus less on compliance costs and instead more on security. And workforce is a similar area, which is, both industry and government have real workforce challenges when it comes to cybersecurity, and getting, improving the talent pipeline, right, is fundamental to our success in this space. So the first national cyber director, Chris Inglis, used to say at every opportunity. So I am positive that you have all heard this before, but cyberspace comprises, right, technology, people, and doctrine, right? Like that was Inglis's. Some people say process, like he was doctrine. That's the brigadier general coming out. So we at ONCD spend a lot of time talking about doctrine, right? We are big into federal coherence, but we also look a lot at the people element. And while we've talked a lot on the panel about how do we make sure that the fundamental technology through the use of standards, through the use of principles and secure by default and secure by design, that we're building from a secure foundation, just as important as people are, operating in cyberspace, right? The technology doesn't exist for its own purposes. It exists to achieve ends for society, and it's people who are using the technology to achieve those ends. And so the approach that we're looking at in this national cyber workforce and education strategy is to say, two major things. One is that fundamentally there are real workforce gaps today and that we foresee in the future, and we need to close those gaps for people that have cybersecurity as part of their job title, the people that wake up in the morning and think, I'm here to make, a system run more securely so that we can benefit from it. But we also need to recognize that in order to do that, you need to move way back up the chain to get earlier into the education system, because the digital skills that people are going to rely on, right, that they need in order to successfully operate in the economy are the same skills that will help people get into the cyber talent pipeline and help them get into a position where they're actually working day to day to secure the technology that we increasingly rely on and will ever more increasingly rely on. So that's the fundamentals of the approach, recognizing that we could just spend an entire panel talking about workforce. But the good news is that, that workforce and education strategy is just about ready to go. So we will expect, we are, I don't want to be in Tom's position, but like when I say soon, like soon, right? It will be soon. I will not put a specific date on it because who knows? But I would expect this summer, right? We will see that, initiative 4.6.1. My favorite parts of the implementation plan are the roll-up pages up front, so I can just get all 69 of the initiative numbers. But 4.6.1, a milestone in that is releasing the strategy, and I think you can expect to see that soon.
Fantastic. We're going to have to leave it there. I'm just going to take a second. Moderator's privilege to recognize some of my colleagues. I'm up here. We are super fortunate at ITI not just to work with great cybersecurity companies, many of whom are here. James Hayes, chairman of our board, happens to be from a cybersecurity company. Courtney Lang, John Miller, Leopold Wildenauer are not here. They contributed to this event, but ITI's international and domestic engagement on cyber could not be better because of those people. So I want to thank them. And if you could join me in thanking our panelists. Okay, Kevin.
So if it's not obvious, we're trying to cover a lot of ground today. Each of these discussion topics, whether it be, harmonization, cybersecurity performance management goals, or workforce, each is rightfully deserving of its own session. So, but I think Tom hit it right on the head. This is the beginning of the discussion. We need more stakeholder engagement. So as you can see, we got a lot of ground to cover as we work through the implementation. So I challenged my industry colleagues to make sure that we do what's being called for and engage with as stakeholders in this very important process. So we're going to move quickly on to panel 2. Like panel 1, these leaders really need no introductions. They're very highly regarded throughout government and by many of us in industry. First up is Drennan Dudley, Assistant National Cyber Director for Budget Review and Assessment. Drennan, thank you very much for being here. Stephen Kelly, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Cybersecurity and Emerging Technology at the National Security Council. Stephen, thanks so much for being here. And then Liesl Franz. Liesl is Acting Deputy Assistant. Oh, congratulations. She is Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Cyberspace Security in the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the Department of State. Things kind of move quickly in Washington. But we're glad that you're positioned and in the job, Liesl. Thank you for being here. And then Sean Newell, Senior Counsel to the Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice. Sean, thank you for being here. And Rob Strayer, Executive Vice President Policy at ITI, will moderate this session. Rob, thank you so much.
Thanks, James.
Take it away.
Thanks for those wonderful introductions. Appreciate it. I want to thank our panel for the time they're taking away from their busy jobs at the White House and at the State Department and the Department of Justice. Washington is littered with the skeletons and bodies of great strategies that were never implemented. And, this implementation plan is a major step forward in seeing the national cyber strategy become a reality. When I worked in the past administration, I know how much work it took just to do a 5G security strategy at that time and an implementation plan that followed it. And knowing that you're covering the entire economy and the entire US government and state and local governments with a strategy is a daunting task and really needs a sharp and directed implementation strategy. I think that's what we have here. So I'm going to start with you, Drennan, because the Office of National Cyber Director is really the quarterback putting forward this implementation plan. The Biden administration has made steps to move from just information sharing into more aggressive collaboration with the private sector. The CISA within the Department of Homeland Security now has a JCDC, which is the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. Can you tell us from your perspective, Drennan, why it's important to continue to move down this road of operational collaboration between the government and the private sector?
Happy to, and good morning. Thank you for having us. I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, one of the big call outs in the strategy is to make sure that we're moving from information sharing, which is obviously critically important, to working together. And that means collaboration, right? It's a word that we can throw around, but in the end, what it really drives is by working together, it's driving outcomes. And that's really, I think, the goal that we're all looking for here, because at the end of the day, if you're in cyberspace and it's a reactive space, we're not going to get nearly as far. We're letting, the threat actors define how we use the space instead of us being proactive about how we want to use it. So driving that collaboration, I think, is really important. We all know the private sector holds a ton of information. There is a lot to get done and a lot of great work being done in the private sector space. And so putting that together with what government can do too, driving that collaboration is just absolutely critical so that we get an outcome instead of everyone sitting with, even if it's information that's been put together in pieces, you're still sitting with the information unless you're all working together and really driving towards getting something done together.
Great, thanks. Sean, I want to turn to you next. You're at the Department of Justice, where there's been some really great progress on collaborating with the private sector in disrupting cyber attacks against both government agencies and the private sector. We just saw the news yesterday that the Secretary of Commerce's email account was compromised, as well as senior officials' accounts within the State Department. So we know that there's very sophisticated nation state actors that are out there. We know there's criminal actors, and some of those form criminal ransomware groups. There's also others seeking to cause mayhem and other compromises to information technology and networks around the world. So some of the major initiatives within this implementation plan are being done by the Department of Justice and by the FBI. Within DOJ, you've recently made some more structural efforts to put yourself on an even stronger footing in these areas to deal with these disruption campaigns. Could you, at least in this first round, talk about what kind of structural changes you've made to put yourself in a better position and why those are necessary?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate the cutting process there. Recently, as some of you might have seen, the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Matt Olson, recently announced that the National Security Division was standing up a dedicated section to national security cyber threats. A lot of the work against nation state threat actors had previously resided in the counterintelligence and export control section alongside other portfolios such as export control, espionage and the like. And they took a hard look at that and decided that the scope and scale of the threat from the nation state actors required expanding our resources dedicated to that. And so he stood up this new section on equal footing with other sections within NSD. They will have prosecutors, analysts, and the like devoting 100% of their time, 100% of their day to disrupting the threat, to working with our partners in the interagency and to working with the private sector to come up with solutions to some of these problems. I think going back to your last question, if you look at a lot of the press releases over the last 2 years, particularly when it comes to technical operations against the nation state threat, you look at the Hafnium malware removal operation, the Cyclops Blink botnet takedown, the recent takedown of the Snake malware that FSB has used. That has all been done by a small cadre of prosecutors within another section. We are now bringing them into the new section, adding some reinforcements and hoping to kind of increase the scope and scale of that. But those operations, to your prior point, really, if you look at all of them in the press releases, you will see continued shout outs to the private sector partners who really help make that happen. And that's why I said this section should really be a one-stop shop for collaboration with the private sector and DOJ.
Great, excellent. Steve, I want to turn to you next. There's an initiative within this implementation plan talking about the importance of sector risk management agencies identifying the types of intelligence and information that the private sector could benefit from in order to be better partners with the US government in addressing cyber campaigns that are being targeted against them. You've served now twice in the White House at the National Security Council. You have a long career at the FBI doing cyber policy. From your perspective, why is it so important that we continue to push on this information sharing with the private sector?
Thanks, Rob. There's a long history of efforts and policymaking initiatives to tackle the problem of cyber threat, tipping of the private sector, of things that the intelligence community is seeing, and communicating to the private sector what are the things that the U.S. government would benefit from hearing about from them that they're seeing on their networks. Back in the Obama administration, Executive Order 13636 on improving the nation's critical infrastructure cybersecurity. Section 4 of that was exactly on this point of how can the U.S. government, with all of our holdings, be more nimble and responsive to the needs of critical infrastructure owners and operators that are specifically at threat. And there was processes developed to make sure that that was working. And there's been thousands and thousands of examples of where targeted entities have been notified, classified information has been downgraded so that those engagements can happen by FBI and CISA and others that have that relationship. This kind of takes it to the next step, the idea that as we further scope what is a sector risk management agency, what do we want those agencies to be doing, what capability do we want to have in those offices, and this dovetails between the National Cybersecurity Strategy and an effort to revisit Presidential Policy Directive 21 on critical infrastructure security resilience. That rewrite or refresh of that process is underway right now, and kind of revalidating the sector structure, revalidating the assignments of SRMAs to those sectors, and as part of all of this kind of milieu of work is the question of how do we, amp up our intelligence support and push that forward. So one of the things we need is for those with the sector-specific expertise to be helping the intelligence community understand what they need to be looking for in the intel. Because if there's terms and system names or things that an analyst wouldn't even notice, or frankly, there's holdings out there that unless you query it, you're not going to find it. And so we need to start to bring these communities together to have a more efficient and more effective way of bringing to the surface things that are of importance. And so that kind of speaks to it. And then, of course, how do we act on it quickly and how do we act on it on scale? Because the model of where we have a report, it's a PDF, and we downgrade a certain chunk of text and then somebody has to run down the street to tell that's great, but that's 10 years ago model. And then it gets into how do we do that at scale? How do we do it more nimbly? How do we leverage structures like the JCDC at CISA? And these are things that will hopefully come together, and we intend to come together in the implementation of the National Cybersecurity Strategy. And I can't predict exactly where that's going to land, but that's the direction of travel.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially when there's at least hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars losses every year to cybercrime. We need to work more quickly, expeditiously to share this information and really include the people that are being under attack. And as the adversaries also keep changing their methods, their TTPs to be once try to move a step ahead of the defensive measures. It seems like it's really important to have this dialogue about the information that's needed.
Yeah, let me just end with one thought on this, which is in previous times, we were worried about espionage types of scenarios. And to the extent that critical infrastructure was being implicated by cyber attacks, and ransomware is certainly an example of that. It's kind of perhaps incidental. Our concern now moving into the current era, as we've seen how the modern wars are being fought, like in Ukraine with, cyberspace operations are part of warfare. And so we need to make sure that our critical infrastructure is ready, our owners and operators are ready, and we're resilient. And we're very concerned that our critical infrastructure is being held at risk, and we need to correct for that. And that's kind of the sense of urgency that we're operating under, is to solve for that problem.
Great, thanks. I want to turn a little bit to ransomware now, which is a big focus of many initiatives within the overall implementation plan, as well as in the strategy. And Sean, I'm going to start with you and then turn to Liesl next. There's responsibilities for the Department of Justice to really coordinate among this broad set of interested stakeholders in addressing ransomware, which is, of course, U.S. government, state and local governments, and then internationally, foreign governments, all of the private sector, various number of other non-private sector stakeholders, consumers, and others that could be impacted by ransomware. So, Sean, could you just give us a little bit of sense of why this is so important, and maybe some initial thoughts on how this initiative will be addressed?
Yeah, absolutely right. Ransomware is obviously front and center in our minds, the Department of Justice and the FBI. There are some, I think, very good initiatives that are getting off the ground right now. The Joint Ransomware Task Force is co-led by FBI and CISA is one example of that. We're bringing together all the experts from around the interagency and the private sector. And there's the JCDC that we've mentioned here is plugged into that effort, and other private sector partners. So, I think we are focusing on that. We're standing up this new mechanism. And, at least from the Department of Justice perspective, including the FBI, we're really looking at disrupting that threat at all stages of our work. I mean, some might say it's heresy to prosecutors to think that, if there's any goal besides getting someone in a courtroom and putting cuffs on them and getting them in a courtroom and charging them with a crime and finding them guilty. But really, I think the signal that has been sent throughout the department, the FBI, by leadership is, yes, that continues to be a goal, and it will always will be, but we really have to continue to focus on our victim-centric mission, which is disrupting the threat at all stages, not just in the end. That means at every stage, including when you open an investigation, throughout until you get to that final stage, hopefully someday, where you have someone arrested, that you are looking to disrupt the actors to buy space for the network defenders and the like. And so that is a huge focus. That's why you're starting to see, coming out of our ransomware efforts, a lot more disruptive operations, like the Hive operation, where we infiltrated their network and we're swiping the decryptor keys from underneath their noses for months on end without them knowing it, and turning that around hand to the private sector. That was an operation that was designed to, like I said, really help the victims out before we get to that end goal of our investigations. And so you're going to see a lot more of that, I think, over the coming years here as we focus efforts on that. But you did mention international. I think that's really important. as part of our strategy on ransomware, we're really going after key nodes in the ecosystem, not just the individual actors, but a lot of the things in the ecosystem that are supporting them. That includes the darknet markets where the initial access brokers are selling the creds. They're allowing the ransomware actors to get into the system. That includes the money launderers at the mixers and the illicit exchanges out there. They're helping them launder their crypto payments to get out. So and also, I think the big players like the malware coders and the like, who are really helping maybe the folks in the ransomware ecosystem who don't have that like varsity level talent, but someone else is providing them with the tools they need to still cause a very significant problem. So we're going after those key nodes, and key to that is international partnerships. If you look at a lot of our successes in that ecosystem targeting over just the last 4 months, you have us taking down the Bislotto cryptocurrency exchange, the Hive operation I mentioned, the chip mixer takedown. Chip mixer was a mixer that laundered over 3 billion in cryptocurrency over its life. And then Genesis Market, which again is an example of initial access broker marketplace. Each one of those operations had a significant number of foreign partners. I think Genesis Market, for example, was probably 30 foreign partners assisted in that operation and really made an impact. So we're really looking to leverage those partnerships, and not just in the criminal space, but also the national security space as well.
Right, right. And the goal here is to continue to scale up those really amazing things. I mean, the story behind Hive, which was announced by DOJ in January. And I know that your boss, the Deputy Attorney General, talked about that at the Munich Security Conference, really got the attention of the world, the capabilities that DOJ and the rest of the US government sit on to disrupt some of these operations. The question is, when there's so much out there, how do you continue to scale that, which is why we're talking about a little bit the infrastructure that you're putting in place for this.
That's right. And then we also have the counter ransomware initiative too, which I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention is really someplace where we're looking to scale and also bring in new partners we might not have traditionally worked with over the years into this effort.
Yeah. Liesl, turning to the State Department, it's wonderful to see that there is now a Cyberspace and Digital Policy Bureau, and that you are the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy there, or for cyber policy there. Those that worked in previous administrations worked really hard to move that to the place where it could become a reality. And it's really great to see that become a reality, and now for it to grow with people like you there and others to really grow up this function. It's so important for the US to be involved in international engagement on cyber policy. Sticking with just kind of the more narrow set of ransomware, the initiative tags the State Department to lead an international engagement plan for ransomware. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of how that might develop?
Sure. Thanks, Rob, and thanks for having me here today. I'll answer that question directly and then maybe take a step back for just a second. But so nice to see some old friends, old bosses here in the room, old colleagues. So there's a diplomatic track to the counter ransomware initiative, and part of that is to make sure that we are building that coalition across the tracks, that the more operational tracks, as well as the countries that participate in holding these actors accountable and taking steps to disrupt at every stage, as Sean said. So we are very active in building the coalition, convening countries that can support those interagency processes abroad, and utilizing our folks in our embassies to help do that, and through other diplomatic efforts. We'll be coming up on the second CRI summit at the end of October, 1st of November.
Counter ransomware
the
initiative.
Counter Ransomware Initiative Summit. And so we will be able to reflect a growing number of countries that are not only members, but really engaged in all of those tracks. And I think, as Sean said, engaging partners that we haven't really engaged on those very specific operational targets. So that, I think, is the very specific aspect with regard to the ransomware piece that we hold. And if I just step back for a second, Washington may be littered with a bunch of strategies that haven't had an implementation plan, but in many ways, I do think they have been implemented. And I think it's fair to say, and perhaps you heard a little bit about this in the previous panel from Kemba, that the current strategy builds on and sort of represents an evolutionary approach in our strategy development, even as far back as 2003. So we've got 2003, we've got the 2011 International Cyberspace Strategy, the 2018 efforts on international engagement and deterrence strategy. So in some aspects, this strategy builds on those iterative and evolutionary approaches, but also, as you probably heard, lifts and shifts burden and takes some new direction around various aspects that aren't 10 years ago. And it is a national cybersecurity strategy, but obviously it has a couple of international aspects to it in pillars 2 and 5 that we're talking about today. And, you know, international cyberspace means that international efforts are just as important for the national aspect. And there are 4 elements for us, not just the ransomware, counter ransomware initiative from the diplomatic aspect that we are involved in, but also looking at foreign assistance through our DCCP and CHIPS funding efforts, and the emergent work we're trying to do with the private sector to more agilely respond to emergent needs. And one of your questions earlier was, how can the private sector engage with us? So that is definitely one way, finding new mechanisms to answer those calls, emergent calls, more in a more agile and timely manner. You know, we are still pushing forward on affirming the international world order, the framework for responsible state behavior in cyberspace. It's taking a new process, ending sort of a long 2 decades worth of work on creating that framework, and now looking at moving it forward even further. And then just finally, we are tapped as our new bureau by the NDAA to write a new international cyberspace and digital strategy. So that's sort of the universe of things that we're represented in the national cybersecurity strategy. And so more to come, more depth and breadth, I think, on the international side.
Excellent. You know, a number of things you just talked about get at capacity building, and capacity building in a budgeteer's mind, those that have done budget for years, like Drennan here on the Hill and now at ONCD, they hear resources and dollars behind it. So I'm going to let you answer first, or demur to defer to others on this if you choose. OMB isn't here, so they can't stop you. But there's a number of initiatives as you mentioned, first of all, there's capacity building within the department to train cyber attachés at missions around the world. There's this capacity building with partner countries so they can be more agile, provide more agile assistance so that no country is a safe haven for ransomware or other cyber criminals, which is a major tenet of the strategy. And then there's this notion that when a cyber incident occurs, many countries come to the United States government for assistance. So the cyber incident response is also in there. I know the US government has taken some recent steps to help out countries like Albania and Costa Rica, but that always requires more resources. So how do you see the trajectory on resources other than just going up? Is there processes in place to help address this for the State Department?
That's a good question. And my good lawyers will tell me that I am not supposed to ask for any more money beyond the president's budget. So I'll leave that there. But we have found this need. Yes, we have been doing capacity building for countries that are in a situation where they need national strategies. They need help with incident response teams. They need help with dealing with the scourge of ransomware, whatever the latest tactics are by adversaries and criminals. So we for a long time have been doing that at a very small scale, but small but mighty abilities to do that, and leveraging other groups to do that, funding by other interagency partners or international partners, or utilizing our efforts with, for example, regional security or regional organizations like the OSCE or OAS to find pennies in the couch cushions, as you say. But so we've had a long time effort of doing that. You know, for a long time, even before the Bureau or even before SCCI, my predecessor organization, existed. But what we have seen is that that traditional foreign assistance or capacity building has a very long trajectory. It's supposed to be over time. It's for countries that are eligible for foreign assistance. So there's a lot of diligence to capacity building funding. But with those emergent cases, Ukraine is one, obviously, and Albania and Costa Rica are two, Rob, that you mentioned that needed more a mechanism and funding and implementers on a more emergent and agile basis. And so we sort of look at capacity building sort of over the long term to build up capacity around the world, this turnkey emergent need, and then making sure that there's sustainability over time. So we're looking at a very strategic approach to be able to do it in that more fulsome way.
Excellent. Sounds perfect. Drennan, you've forgotten more about budget processes and appropriation cycles than many of us will ever know. I can say that having worked with you for years on the Hill and more recently. Can you tell us from your ONCD perspective now, how you will use, how ONCD and the director will use the authorities that you have to ensure that there's alignment of the implementation plan, budget cycles, and budgets for each of the agencies that are tagged with either leading implementation of one of the initiatives or supporting that?
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the compliment. Look, I'm really fortunate to be on a panel right now and sitting at a table with so much expertise. And we know that that expertise only gets enabled with resources. There's just no doubt about it. On the panel are also two brand new offices, all of us starting to galvanize towards making sure that the government structure is aligned towards and also resourced in a way that really gets us the president's bold affirmative vision that's in the strategy through the implementation plan. So I think ONCD sits in a bit of a unique position, as you mentioned, Rob, in two ways. One, looking across all of the federal agencies and sort of doing an inventory of where we're spending money now, right? This is something that our budget team can do. And that means looking across where is their operational activity happening? Where are training opportunities happening? Where are workforce, as Kemba and Nick both talked about before, where are workforce activities happening? So we can be very strategic about where we're placing funding because we can see the full picture of it. Because being strategic about spending funding does make sure that you're getting bang for your buck and that you are, if resources are limited, and they are, and we are linked to the hip with OMB and talking about where our top lines are and then how we can operate under that top line to make sure we get the resources that we need for cybersecurity. So being linked to the hip with them means being strategic and making sure that the resources that we're using are being spent on all of those priorities. Priorities meaning then turning to the implementation plan where we ONCD are specifically tagged with working with OMB as an annual process that we started 2 years ago. This most recent version was the second year where we're actually, again, linked to the hip with OMB and sitting down and writing a memo that talks about that specifically describes what the priorities are that the Executive Office of the President would like for departments and agencies to include in their budget proposals so that we can see those up front. And for all of those who have been in this town for a while, you know that the budgeting process starts with a federal agency developing their budget. So this is our iteration of saying, please include these activities in your budget. So from the very beginning, we're talking about thinking about the priorities clearly, being strategic about it, including that in the first document. It then goes through the budget, the president's budget process. That's the proposal to Capitol Hill for what the president sees holistically across all the agencies for all of his priorities, including cyber priorities. And then last, making sure that because we've documented it on the very beginning end, we can follow it all the way through the appropriations process and see where we fared, not only by being able to talk clearly to the Hill about what the priorities are and how they fit together, but also by following through and making sure that we see where that funding landed and can year after year, you know, Nick mentioned that he likes the iteration of the implementation plan because he's an engineer. Budgeteers by heart are also iterators. And so it's nice to see year after year, where do you ask for the funding? How do you see it through all the way through the process to the very end, where we actually get funding to the agencies? So.
Great. Excellent. Sounds like you'll be an excellent steward for US taxpayer dollars. We're running low on time, but I want to turn to Steve to answer anything he wants to add to that question about how the budget process will work. And I have one more question for you, if you don't mind.
Okay, so let me just make this one
Okay,
statement.
go ahead.
Lisa and I and probably others have been part of strategy drafting across 3 administrations. And this is actually the first time I've seen budget guidance so clearly linked with a national strategy to be able to carry these agendas forward. And so ONCD working with OMB to map this process, to do what they're doing, really fills a gap. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing how this plays out, because I think we have a much better chance of accomplishing what we've set out.
Right. the question I want to ask you before we do a wrap up is there's also an initiative in here in the implementation plan about not ensuring that US digital infrastructure is not being used by adversaries to compromise US interests. Specifically, the implementation plan calls for a rulemaking to be conducted by the Commerce Department to outline risk prevention standards and procedures that can be used by those that run cloud infrastructure. I'm not going to ask you to outline what those would be. It's premature to probably ask for that. But can you just talk about the need for this? It's been 2.5 years since there was an executive order sort of announcing that there would be something on this in this area. But now it's going to happen because of the implementation plan. But can you just talk about the risk that you're addressing?
Yeah, I'll be very brief because I know we're almost out of time. Certainly, the reference to President Trump's executive order 13984 was the purpose of that was to reaffirm, and we went through a process to revalidate that the issue of foreign malicious cyber actors misusing US-based infrastructure to conduct attacks here and elsewhere is still a problem, and we wanted to continue to implement that EO. There was a bit of a pause as we moved into this administration to make sure that we were still on the right track, but that has been affirmed, and so the strategy clearly makes that statement that is policy that we intend to continue to implement in this administration. I think that the biggest innovation in that particular executive order is the idea. Of course, it mandates a know your customer requirement for infrastructure as a service, but it has an interesting clause, section 1C, that offers providers that would be subject to a rule that comes out on this topic another way. Other ways to manage that risk. And so it's an opportunity to think creatively about how we address this. We certainly don't want our infrastructure to be misused to attack us or anybody else in the same way that we would like other countries as well to police as best as possible. That they're not emanating malicious cyber activity as well. So I can't speak for Commerce as to the timetable of their efforts, but it is certainly a problem that we still recognize and are looking forward to taking a positive step towards addressing it.
Great, thanks for addressing that. Just to wrap up, I'd like each of you, starting with Sean at the far end, to tell us what we as the private sector can do to really make it your implementation, what's in your responsibilities as an agency, make that implementation successful. What is it in as concrete as you can be about in what areas would you want more feedback to help you do the work that you're going to be doing in the years ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll be brief on two fronts really from the private sector. Number one, the reporting. I think we recently in Hive, part of that rollout, show that only 20% of the victims of that ransomware variant had reported to law enforcement. That's just a number that's way too low if we're going to have any sort of disruption effort. And we need to up that number somehow. And then I think also on the disruption front, I mentioned the technical operations and the like, the Hafnium, the Cyclops Blink, the recent Snake one. We need the private sector to come forward when they spot opportunities for those types of operations, because we have the tools and the legal authorities to get them done. But sometimes we need help spotting those.
Shannon?
I would say that, this can't get done without all of us. And so stakeholders must be at the table. If you are not feeling that you're at the table, call us and let us know so that we can resolve that problem quickly.
Great. Steve?
Critical infrastructure security resilience, both on trying to implement minimum cybersecurity requirements, which gets into the earlier panel, but then also collaborating around the threat and reacting to it, responding to it, and making sure that we're building up our capacity.
Great. Liesl?
I guess I would start by saying the creation of our bureau as part of the Secretary Blinken's modernization plan. So I'm hoping that prioritization is reflected in budget and iterative iterations of resources. But part of that is also, looking at, Rob, as you mentioned, our expertise in our embassies abroad. So I guess I would say work with us at State Department here in Washington. If you're a global company and you have presence or business abroad, please do connect with our embassies abroad. The cyber and digital officers are there. And I'll just say the last thing I would say about the Bureau is that we have the previous existing cyberspace security entity, our digital policy, our international communications policy element, and a new unit on digital freedom. So think about all of those things in an integrated fashion, or maybe we're catching up to you thinking about it in an integrated fashion. So work with us here and abroad.
Excellent. Well said. I just want to thank all of you that have come here in person today from the private sector and the other experts in the cybersecurity area. We at ITI look forward to engaging with the government, US government, to really make this implementation successful. We have a cybersecurity committee at ITI that represents our 80 most innovative cybersecurity companies in this area. And so we're going to be continue to follow up and making sure that we can be good partners in this. I just want to also thank Director Walden, NIST, Department of Homeland Security, State Department, the National Security Council, of course, ONCD, and the Department of Justice for joining us today. And please join me in showing appreciation of this excellent panel.